When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
An expert witness is critical because they're going to have that deep level knowledge to really determine if something stands out that doesn't look quite right.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
My brain just sort of exploded with different ideas. Even a single-celled organism can solve a crime.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
We're constantly evolving, constantly improving. It's soon going to become impossible to get away with murder.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
That was one of my eureka moments in all my 30 years of forensic examination.
The chances of finding something were really incredibly slim. That tiny possibility had to be explored.
I've seen people talk about justice being done, but no matter what kind of punishment he faced, it would never be enough.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, we're in Edinburgh to find out how a forensically trained dentist is brought in to identify marks on a teenager's body.
The lower teeth are relatively regular and lacking in any incisal edge defect, and that in itself can be significant.
And an expert witness joins an operation to tackle a shady business targeting football fans.
This is a huge red flag. It really just comes down to a keen eye and my 30 years plus experience.
Bite mark analysis has a role to play. It's not a simple role, but it does make a safe and reliable contribution to criminal justice, and that's been demonstrated in cases in the UK over decades.
December 2018. It's a freezing morning in Edinburgh when a dog walker discovers the body of a girl. Police are alerted and quickly identify the victim as 15-year-old Mary O'Neill.
Police are asking the public to come forward if they have any information about the final hours of a teenager who was found dead in Edinburgh. The body of 15-year-old Mary O'Neill was discovered on Calton Hill early on Saturday after she failed to return home on Friday night.
Kerry Nixon is a consultant forensic psychologist and has closely examined this case.
Mary O'Neill was a 15-year-old girl who went to Portobello High School. She lived in a little town near Edinburgh called Willowbrae. Her parents described her as being obsessed with music, and her dream was to one day study music at university. The events of the night of the incident are so incredibly sad for any parent to listen to. She told her parents that she was meeting a friend and going to the Christmas markets in Edinburgh. But actually, she was going to meet a boy, an 18-year-old man, that she had been chatting to on an online app called Yubo. They'd been talking and agreed to meet up on that night.
Analysis of Mary's social media accounts revealed that the man she met was Ewan Fulton, a shop worker from Livingston.
He shares, in his words, a bottle of vodka with her, but she gets so drunk that he says she can't walk. He then admits that there was sexual activity and what he described as heavy petting. He also admits that there was biting and there was love bites on her body to substantiate that, and also some compressing of her neck.
Retired Detective Chief Superintendent Paul Dockley followed the case closely.
She met with Ewan Fulton, who then plied her with drink and took her to an isolated location. With the content of the alcohol she drank, she was incapable of getting herself back home.
Fulton claimed Mary lost consciousness, at which point he left her on the bench and went home. A post-mortem showed Mary subsequently died from hypothermia.
This is where a young lady has actually been left to die on a very cold night in Edinburgh. She was sexually assaulted and left partly clothed with no assistance given to getting her back to safety. His intention probably wasn't for her to die, but subsequently she did because of his negligence. He didn't take care of her. Here's a man of 18 who's with a 15-year-old girl, and he's more concerned about getting his train home than he is about the welfare of Mary.
Police needed evidence to prove Fulton was responsible for Mary's death and turned to texts sent between them.
The key evidence was the information on the phones. So the prior communication between Mary and Fulton, before they met, he texted her saying, "Oh my God, you're going to freeze to death." He knew from the text message that it was freezing. He'd sent that, "Oh my God, you're going to freeze to death." That was in his head. She was 15, she was drunk. He left a girl that was unable to walk, was unable to speak. Anybody leaving that place would know that they were leaving that girl in danger.
Once police had announced that Fulton was in custody, a number of other young women came forward and reported that they had suffered similar assaults.
The significance of Fulton's previous offending is so important in this case. He's got a history of assaults. He's got a history of targeting young girls. He's got a history of biting. He's got a history of compressing necks. They are all significant risk factors. This was a young man who was showing many signs of high risk of committing a sexual offence. He then admitted it. He admitted his guilt, that he did leave her, and he admitted that his actions led to her death, or his inaction led to her death.
Fulton had admitted his guilt, but that admission could easily be withdrawn.
Now that admission needs corroboration, because obviously he could retract his admission at any time. In addition, we will want to prove that he was actually the offender who bit the body.
Detectives still needed to prove their case and looked for evidence to show beyond doubt that Fulton sexually assaulted Mary before leaving her to die. They turned to forensic odontologist Dr. Douglas Sheasby.
I got a call from Police Scotland in December 2018. They asked for my assistance in the investigation of suspected bite marks in this female victim.
Police hoped Dr. Sheasby, by using his expertise, could match a mark left on Mary's body to Fulton's teeth.
This is the image of one of the bite marks. We're looking at two superimposed bite marks in this location. We have an initial contact with the upper front teeth, and then a second contact, a more forceful contact with the biting edges of the upper incisor teeth.
By studying the police photos, Dr. Sheasby worked out the likely dental features that caused the injury.
The identifying features were the upper central incisor teeth were distinctive in terms of the marks that they left. There's also detail of the biting edges of the lower incisors. So there was a lot of identifiable, distinctive features.
Dr. Sheasby next compared his conclusions to a cast of Fulton's actual teeth.
The dental cast examination is a relatively simple one because you're looking at life-size duplicates of this person's teeth, and it's just a simple matter of making clinical notes, if you like, of the teeth that are present, their position, and their identifying features in terms of biting edges, cusps, etc. And simply a note of all of your findings of this examination.
This similar cast shows some of the features Dr. Sheasby looks out for.
So in this case, the upper dental arch is clearly not regular. We have the lateral incisor, which is displaced towards the lip. The biting edges, the incisal edges of the central incisors are deficient. So there are certain features that are noteworthy. The lower teeth are relatively regular and lacking in any incisal edge defect, and that in itself can be significant.
Dr. Sheasby compared the results from the photos with those features identified on Fulton's cast.
The comparison of the predictor in this case with the examination of the dental cast of the suspect biter provided an explanation for all of the features that were visible in the mark, and consequently this person caused this bite mark.
A youth has been charged in connection with the death of a 15-year-old found dead at Calton Hill in Edinburgh. Mary O'Neill from Willow Brae was discovered at the city landmark in December last year. An 18-year-old is due to appear at Edinburgh Sheriff Court later.
In June 2021, at Edinburgh Sheriff Court, Ewan Fulton pleaded guilty to sexual activity with a child and to the culpable homicide of Mary O'Neill.
The culpable homicide charge stated that Fulton acted with utter disregard for the consequences of his actions towards Mary. He'd abandoned the girl in a remote and exposed location in a state of partial undress, without means to contact anyone, and he failed to seek help for her.
I would imagine that the officers in this case worked extremely hard to draw together the evidence. And the work of the odontologist, Dr. Sheasby, was critical in proving the guilt of Fulton in this case.
Well, the police are always happy when an opinion is expressed that supports obviously what they're doing. They're under huge pressure in all sorts of ways, so it's a good feeling.
Expert witnesses are crucial. It is the job of the police and the courts to determine guilt or innocence. So when you have something like a bite mark and you have the perpetrator, an expert witness who is able to say those two things go together, that is crucial, because then there's no uncertainty.
After court, Mary's parents said they'd lost their beautiful girl who was loved by everyone. Fulton will be sentenced next month.
The court must have taken into consideration the fact that there was only 2 to 3 years between their ages at the time of these offences being committed. And he was sentenced to 2 years and 3 months imprisonment. He will be on the sex offenders register for the remaining of his life.
Fulton, who's now 20, admitted killing Miss O'Neill. He took part in sexual activity with her and compressed her neck and culpably and recklessly endangered her health and life and exposed her to risk of injury and death.
This case is so incredibly sad because we've got a young girl here who's innocently using an app, chatting to a young man, you know, probably excited to meet him. Goes along to what she thinks is a date, and Fulton ends her life.
My satisfaction is derived from safely and reliably being a forensic ornithologist. It makes a difference in large, complex set of circumstances, so I'm one of many contributors to serving justice and getting justice for the family who have lost their daughter.
Over the years, I've seen tens of thousands of signed photographs, documents and so on, and so that gives me the experience and the eye to spot the fake signatures and all the little tricks that the forgers will do to try and fool you.
In recent years, the market for sports memorabilia has exploded. Antiques and art expert Wayne Colquhoun thinks he knows why.
Everybody wants a piece of their idol these days. A signature, a shirt, anything that they've touched, and the whole memorabilia side of the art and antiques profession has grown to develop to give people what they want.
But unfortunately, not every item up for sale can be taken at face value.
The issue of forgery is massive. The piece that I'm looking at, whether it be a work of art, a piece of pottery, a signature, or a piece of sport memorabilia, always has to prove to me that it is genuine. But in the modern context of a current football star's signature, £150 for 3 scrawly bits of writing really is buyer beware. It's take your chances, really.
In 2015, Neil Martin from Dorset Council Trading Standards received a tip-off from a legitimate sporting memorabilia business. They raised concerns about the authenticity of signed items, which were being offered for sale online by a company called FA Premier Signings.
What raised the alarm was the range of signatures that this company purported to have. He knew from experience there are certain players that, as a legitimate company, he cannot get signatures from, yet FA Premier Signings were claiming to have unlimited stocks from those players.
In order to investigate, Neil made a test purchase from FA Premier Signings, buying a shirt purportedly signed by Wayne Rooney and having it delivered to a dummy address.
Most items bought from legitimate memorabilia suppliers will come with a certificate of authenticity. FA Premier Signings were no exception. They accompanied this Wayne Rooney shirt with a certificate showing it was a genuine item.
Any idol signature, you're going to be talking, starting at £50 going up, but a Wayne Rooney signature, could be talking about £150. I mean, £150 to some people mightn't sound a lot, but to some people, it's 2 days' work. To some people, it might even be a week's earnings. So a certificate, in my opinion, isn't worth the paper it's written on, because I see far too many certificates out there for what the amount of signatures can be.
And how better to check if a signature is genuine than by going straight to the source?
One of the first steps we did was give the shirt to Wayne Rooney. He examined the signature and said, that's not my signature. And he did do a statement for us, but was not willing to appear in court.
Now, with good reason to suspect that FA Premier Signings were selling forged signatures, Neil needed proof that he could present in court. Enter Gary King, one of the country's leading experts on handwriting and signature analysis.
Initially, I was just sent some images from a very well put together website, FA Premier Signings, and it showed signed football shirts from every one of the Premier League clubs, Arsenal, Man United, Liverpool and so on. Now, if you know anything about obtaining signatures like this, you'll know that it's very difficult to get fully signed shirts from any of these teams, especially in multiples. The value of these shirts can be quite high. A genuine Man United shirt would sell for hundreds of pounds if you could find a genuine one. What stood out from the images I could see on the website were the even spacing and so on of the signatures on the shirts. In the case of a fake signed shirt, you'll often see that the signatures are all the same size, they all slant in the same way, they're nicely evenly spaced, they look perfect, which is often what the customer actually wants. He wants one that looks perfect, but those perfect looking shirts, they are the ones that are fake.
But before he could make a definitive decision, Gary needed to physically examine some of the suspect shirts.
Neil sent me a squad-signed Liverpool shirt, a squad-signed England shirt, and a Thierry Henry Arsenal shirt. The Liverpool shirt was especially interesting because it had a lot of signatures on it, and it also had some of the players' numbers on there as well. All of that is extra detail that makes my life a lot easier. Now, this isn't the shirt Neil sent me because the original shirt has been destroyed by trading standards, but this is a very similar shirt. So the first thing I have to do is to determine whether or not the signatures are actually signed by hand or whether they were perhaps produced mechanically or printed. My work is fairly straightforward. It's actually quite simple. It really just comes down to magnification, a keen eye, and my 30 years plus experience. When you sign your name, you are not just moving your hand across the paper up and down, you're actually moving your hand away from the paper, you're varying the pressure and you're adjusting the speed.
By looking for the telltale marks these subtle changes in pressure and speed leave in ink, Gary was able to determine that the signatures on the suspect shirt had at least been written by hand.
I know they're freehand, but at this point I don't know whether they're fake. So now it comes down to comparing the suspect signatures with known good examples. I could see that the signatures were fairly accurate. He'd done a fairly good job of getting those correct. But looking more closely, I could see that there were significant differences in small areas, the cross of a T, the dot of an I, the way he did the numbers. Too much repetition.
It was the numbers which ultimately allowed Gary to come to his final decision.
Many of the squad have signed their team numbers below their signature, but because the forger has not thought about what he's doing, he's added the numbers in his own hand. So you will see the same numbers repeated in exactly the same style. This is a huge red flag and strongly suggested that all of these signatures were signed by the same person.
Now Gary had concluded that FA Premier signings were selling forged signatures, the investigation into the business could move to the next stage.
We were delighted with Gary's statement when it came back. It confirmed what we strongly suspected, but that gave us the hard evidence to present to the magistrates, and from that they granted us a warrant to actually enter the business premises. The business was being run from a residential address, so we went together with police officers and knocked on the door of the property.
Hi, my name's Neil Martin from Trading Standards in Dorset. You just leave the door open. You just leave the door open.
The business was run from the home of David Rennie in Banbury, Oxfordshire.
Do you know why we're here? Okay, right. What we want to have a look at is your business records and stocks that you keep.
I asked Mr. Rennie, have you been signing these things yourself? And he said, yes. I said to him, how long have you been doing this? And he said, too long. The scale of this business was unbelievable. We were able to establish that FA Premier signings in a 7-year period had sold over 4,500 signed items. We also found that in that period they made a huge amount of money, £1.7 million, but have paid no tax or no national insurance whatsoever. Instead, they spent all the proceeds that they've made on luxury holidays and nice cars.
Greed is often what trips these people up. They produce one signature, sell it, make some money, think, oh yeah, I'll make another one. And before you know it, they're doing dozens of them and making lots of money. But of course, when you do that, you're exposing yourself to the possibility that somebody, trading standards or whatever, is going to spot it. And that's their downfall.
All you need to forge a signature is a piece of paper and a pen and the intent to deceive. And there you are. Once you've made the first £150, it's very tempting to continue to the next £150, carries on, and then suddenly it becomes a £1 million industry which keeps on going until you get caught.
In February 2018, the case went to trial. Mr. Rennie pleaded not guilty to any of the charges brought against him.
Gary King's evidence, because he is regarded as an expert in this country in autographs and handwriting analysis, this wasn't challenged by the defence. They accepted his evidence, and so it was crucial for our case.
Thanks to Gary's expert's testimony, David Rennie was sentenced to 6 years in prison for fraud and money laundering.
This was a very large-scale fraud. They supplied shirts, signed memorabilia, internationally, all around the world from customers. There are thousands of people out there who were disappointed to find that actually what they bought were fake signatures, absolutely worthless. That was heartbreaking. There were people who had bought items for their partners for a special birthday, thinking they'd bought them something really special for their favourite team or favourite player, and it turned out what they bought was worthless. It just goes to show how ruthless and unfeeling FA Premier signings were as a business.
It's diabolical that these people trade on the misery of young children and unsuspecting members of the public who will find out that they've been duped. It brings all the profession, whether it be in memorabilia or art and antiques, into question.
It is important that what we buy as consumers is genuine, and it's very satisfying for me when we do get somebody into court and we prove that what they've been doing is fakery and they get their just desert.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
An expert witness is critical because they're going to have that deep level knowledge to really determine if something stands out that doesn't look quite right.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
My brain just sort of exploded with different ideas. Even a single-celled organism can solve a crime.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
We're constantly evolving, constantly improving. It's soon going to become impossible to get away with murder.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
That was one of my eureka moments in all my 30 years of forensic examination.
The chances of finding something were really incredibly slim. That tiny possibility had to be explored.
I've seen people talk about justice being done, but no matter what kind of punishment he faced, it would never be enough.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, we're in Kent to reveal how, when a murder case collapsed, it took the ingenuity of an expert witness to ensure justice was delivered.
A
did a lot of experiments to try and gain an understanding of the circumstances under which a stain, as seen on the hooded top, could be deposited.
And after a lengthy operation to convict 2 prolific fraudsters,
got to get people to start becoming carbon neutral.
A forensic data specialist is brought in to help save the case.
It's our duty under the rules of disclosure to make sure that we've looked at everything that we've taken possession of. But we need more time.
We can get quite a lot of information forensically from blood, so we can extract DNA from it, try and establish who it came from. We can look at the pattern, as in how it's been distributed around a space, but we can also examine how it changes over time. That includes it drying and how it's moved from one surface to another. And that transfer and persistence of blood in this case was the critical element.
Tunbridge Wells, 2006. A teenage girl who'd just arrived by train on Easter Monday goes missing. Retired Detective Chief Superintendent Paul Dockley followed the case with interest.
Terry Edmonds, 17-year-old girl who's described as bright, beautiful, headstrong, confident, took the train to Tunbridge Wells. Her intention was to stay at the Christian hostel in Tunbridge Wells and meet some friends. However, we don't see that she made that connection.
2 weeks later, there was still no sign of Terry. But thanks to the media and police appeals, the case was well known all around Tunbridge Wells. And the public were quick to report anything suspicious.
A taxi driver using a multi-storey car park noticed a suitcase wedged under the ramp leading into the car park, which he quickly reported to the police, and the body of Terry Edmonds was found within the suitcase. Because the body was 2 weeks old, there was a high level of decomposition. It was thought that her possible cause of death was asphyxiation, and there was elements of blood found in the suitcase.
Detectives immediately began by asking what evidence the suitcase could provide. They turned to blood and DNA specialist Joe Millington.
There was a little tiny switch on the back of the suitcase which allowed you to pull the handle out. It was like a retractable handle, quite a textured little button. So we took DNA from that surface and submitted it for analysis, and it identified an individual, a male individual, who was immediately questioned by police.
And when he was interviewed, he said, yes, it was my suitcase. I took it to a charity shop in order to release it to somebody else and could prove that he had done so.
So even though we had recovered DNA and we felt that it was a breakthrough point in that case, it was actually a complete red herring. And there were other red herrings in this case.
Jo and her team believed they had made a major breakthrough when they retrieved another DNA sample, this one from Terry's body. But once again, detectives uncovered a legitimate explanation.
We were consistently recovering DNA which, in the context of the investigation, appeared to be the breakthrough, but actually it was consistently being eliminated. So every now and again we were thinking, wow, you know, we've done it, and then suddenly it was back to ground zero and trying to understand what other opportunities were available.
While Jo's search for evidence continued, detectives themselves looked elsewhere and made a crucial discovery.
Now, this is a complicated case, but it's helped tremendously by the fact that it's the city centre. Tunbridge Wells has CCTV, and that proved very worthwhile to the investigating team. It became fairly clear in this case that there was a local man without accommodation by the name of Bell, who was sleeping in the stairwell in the multi-storey car park.
CCTV footage revealed Philip Bell in the train station on the day Terry went missing. He was walking just 2 seconds behind her, close enough for police to become suspicious.
Where he lived, the stairwell in the multi-storey car park was subjected to search, and in that stairwell they found a number of items, including a sweatshirt, and in CCTV he was seen wearing this sweatshirt, and on it was a small, about the size of a penny, blood stain on the front centre of this sweatshirt, and the blood matched Terry Edmonds.
It was strong evidence Bell was involved in Terry's murder. And when his DNA was found on her body, police believed they had all the proof they needed. Bell was charged with sexual assault and murder. And in February 2007, faced trial at Maidstone Crown Court. The prosecution focused heavily on the DNA evidence.
Although there was a blood stain matching Terry on his hooded top, there's very little attention given to it, which I was upset about, actually, because blood is kind of my thing. So I was thinking, why are we not talking more about the BPA, the blood?
Joe felt that by ignoring the blood evidence, the prosecution undermined the case against Bell.
The DNA in itself was very complex. I mean, we were really at the extremes of our knowledge of DNA mixtures and complexity. And there is no doubt in my mind that that complexity led to the jury being unable to make a decision.
After a 7-week trial, there was a hung jury. So a retrial was scheduled for February 2008. This time, the blood evidence was given more attention. And the pressure was on Joe to explain the importance of the tiny stain to the jury.
It's a really tough job sometimes, because when you give evidence in court, there's a real responsibility to try and distill very complex findings into something that is readily accessible by people who haven't necessarily been experiencing that level of complexity before. So you can't let your guard down, and you need to maintain your concentration.
Philip Bell's defence team argued strongly against the significance of the blood stain that was found on his sweatshirt. They tried to persuade the jury it got there innocently after the murder.
Bell said, well, I wasn't there at the time. There would have been other people who would be frequenting that particular area. Maybe the offender was in the vicinity of where I sleep. Therefore, the blood may have been distributed around the stairwells.
He said that when he returned to his home, the stairwell, he must have brushed against a bloodstain that was present on the banister of a staircase within the multi-storey car park.
Jo reckoned she could design an experiment to test that theory. But with the trial underway, it was too late. It wasn't possible to disprove the defence's argument.
Understandably, the jury came to a decision where they couldn't make their mind up, and it was another hung jury. To go through that once and a hung jury was difficult. To go through it twice was awful.
The third trial was scheduled for January 2009. In the meantime, Jo kept working on the case.
By then, knowing that the presence of the bloodstain had become the issue in the case, I did a lot of really simple experiments.
She wanted to prove whether or not the blood stain on Philip Bell's sweatshirt was made at the time of Terry's murder or long after.
These were done without really any instruction to do it, but I just didn't want to be caught in the headlights again in the witness box. I did lots of these to try and gain an understanding of the circumstances under which a stain, as seen on the hooded top, could be deposited. So this is various volumes of blood that have been deposited on something like a banister, and then these pieces of fabric are placed on and moved across to pick up stains that start to mimic the size of the stain that was found on the hooded top. Obviously, once you get more drops or more blood, the stain is way too big, whereas small amounts of blood are creating stains that look very similar to the stain that was found on the hoodie. And so what I was able to demonstrate is that either the hooded top came into contact with blood that had only just been deposited and had not dried sufficiently, or a larger amount of blood had been present that had dried down just to leave a small amount of still maybe liquid blood, and then he'd come into contact with it. But of course, large volumes of blood hadn't been observed on the stairwell and on the banister, so it left it that the transfer must have happened when a small amount of blood that had transferred very quickly after having first been deposited, which would put him in the crime scene very quickly after she was injured, rather than him having picked up blood inadvertently by accident when he returned to his bed some hours later.
Joe's experiments proved that Bell had been present when Terry was killed, and crucially, this time, the jury was sufficiently convinced to reach a guilty verdict.
I don't often hear about the outcomes of a case, because once I leave the court and the witness box, that's my job done, really. You know, so I don't need to understand what happened, because that really isn't my job, that's the jury's job. But I have to say that when I found out that there had at least been a decision made by the jury, I was utterly relieved.
Bell was convicted of the murder of Terry Edmonds, and his sentence is 28 years imprisonment for the murder and sexual assault of her. He has appealed, but the appeal was dismissed.
The weight of that case, just from a professional point of view, is indelible, really, on the way that I now think, on the way that I now work. So I think it's made me a better scientist. I don't know, but I hope it has, for sure.
This job was huge. Multiple victims, multiple perpetrators. It's a vast amount of information.
In 2012, police were alerted to a case of what's become known as boiler room fraud. It's when criminals use call centres to contact members of the public, offering them a fake investment opportunity. One of the detectives who worked on the case for the City of London Police was Andy Stevenson.
Members of the public would be approached, often by a cold call, offering them an investment in a carbon credit. They were told that this will make 5, 10, 15, 20% on your investment.
Carbon credits are required to be brought from the government by companies whose activities damage the environment. The more damage you do, the more carbon credits the government makes you buy. The money raised is spent on green energy projects to try to address the effects on climate change. The boiler room cold callers were so convincing that many borrowed heavily to invest in the scheme and lost it all.
You're looking at people maybe 50s, 60s, 70s that have got, if they've either retired, maybe they've got a lump sum, maybe they've got some equity in a house. So some of our victims, they remortgaged their house to release some of that equity. And in some cases, it was like hundreds of thousands of pounds. And some people did lose their houses. And some people were borrowing on credit cards. So you're then lumbered with this debt and your life changes.
The company responsible for the scam was Enviro Associates. The directors of the company, Paul Seekins and Luke Ryan, were buying cheap carbon credits and selling them on to the public at a much inflated price. But in November 2012, their scheme began to unravel when their questionable methods were exposed by journalist John Cuthill.
First tonight, we're always told we should do our bit to save the planet. So if someone says you can do just that and make a bit of money, well, you might be tempted. Welcome to the world of carbon trading, a world that's causing some people to see red over going green.
If there's ever a rule for someone who's mis-selling, the rule is don't call a BBC investigations team. And that's what they did. Enviro Associates cold called one of the show's producers, completely out of the blue, with this opportunity of a lifetime to invest in this whole world of carbon credits.
They're still on a promotional offer at £5.50. What are they going to be worth, say, like, you know, when I come to sell them? I think that's really the bottom line, isn't it? The compliance market have to sell at £16 of April next year. So we could potentially push our prices up, possibly to £14.
We arranged a meeting with Enviro Associates with hidden cameras, and we're filming, and in walks Luke Ryan.
This is Jenny, my wife. Jenny, Luke, pleased to meet you.
In his suit, in his tie, he's got all the patter, he's got all the charm and all the smarm. I think all of the team thought, hold on, he seems a little bit of a tricky customer, this one. And we watched him in action.
Okay, you've got Barclays saying that in the next 4 to 5 years, for example, the market could go from anything to 100 to 500%.
Just going on and on and on. This is a market that's just about to blow up. This is just about to go big. This is your chance to get in and make these amazing returns and help the planet. You're doing your green bit by doing this.
Got to get people to start becoming carbon neutral and helping all of these projects out.
Pressure selling, just saying this is what you have to invest in now because the opportunity's so good.
But Luke Ryan was encouraging people to invest in a market which the Financial Services Authority had actually advised was unsuitable for individuals. And the dishonesty didn't stop there. Enviro Associates bought each carbon credit for around just 20p, but they were selling them on to potential investors at a whopping £5, a price they claimed was a discount.
I'll tell you the reason why. It's not that we couldn't sell them at £7, but surely it's more attractive for you to buy them at £5.50. Yeah. So if we have got the opportunity to sell them at £5.50, you know, we want to get excited with people like yourselves about the carbon market. Otherwise, I'd do something else and maybe go work in a bank.
The figures were just completely wrong, and it was all loaded on Enviro Associates' behalf. The carbon credits they were selling weren't worth £5, weren't worth £6. They were barely worth 20p.
There could be some serious money to be made.
We knew that what he was saying was wrong, but for a lot of people, he would have convinced them.
Really, really wonderful. Thank you very much.
So after we filmed Luke Ryan in action, we had to give Enviro Associates a right to reply. And we approached Luke Ryan via email and telephone and said, look, you're making these claims, what is going on? How can you justify these claims? Now, Luke Ryan initially answered us, but he also referred us up to Paul Seekins. But Paul Seekins seemed to be sort of more in the background. Quite a furtive character. We didn't have too many direct dealings with him. So in November 2012, we had exposed Enviro Associates for the company that it was. And we had an approach from the police saying that they were now looking into Luke Ryan and Paul Seekins.
At the start of any criminal investigation, the job is to gather as much material as is possible. You'll send out a massive amount of correspondence to people that you think may be victims to start to build a picture. You can imagine with thousands and thousands of victims who then send you a lot of material back, it very quickly snowballs and the material bundle becomes enormous.
It took police 6 years to sift through all the relevant digital information. But with the trial just months away, the case officer in charge reached retirement and was replaced.
The new case officer came on and, having looked at it with a fresh pair of eyes, thought, well, there may be material there that we need to scrutinise further. And then I came on board in March 2019 to start looking at that material. We're looking at 3.5 terabytes of material, that would equate to 25 million pages of hard copy. If you're looking at 25 million bits of data, that could take 20, 30 years. It's not possible. The police just haven't got the resources.
If police couldn't process the extra material in time, the whole case could fall through. They needed a way to forensically search the data, so Andy turned to head of forensics at the City of London Police, expert witness Tracy Alexander.
By the time I was approached, the trial date was potentially already set. But it's our duty under the rules of disclosure to make sure that we've looked at everything that we've taken possession of. And I was sitting in the back of a taxi, had a frantic text from Andy to say, tried to call you earlier, we have to have an extension, we have to have an extension, can you call? And then send the name of the barrister and a telephone number. So dialed the number, spoke to a fabulous woman who said, I really believe in the case, but the date is set and we would have to make an argument to the judge to say, we need more time. Why do we need more time? It's been going on for years. And we had a conversation along the lines of very complex case, new evidence just come to light, and she took that piece of information to the judge and obviously did a cracking job because we had the extension.
Tracy and the team now had just 12 months to look through all the data, which was stored across 15 different electronic devices.
Clearly we need some kind of solution that's going to enable us to interrogate those devices simultaneously, ideally, very, very quickly. So we can use a tool called e-discovery that assists the police in as much as you can examine the devices that you have with a number of words that you think are appropriate to the investigation in order to work out, is there relevant material in any of those devices?
In the interests of fairness, the defence were also allowed input into what search terms were used.
It's important to make sure that the word search count is fair, but not over the top. The defence will quite often say, oh no, I need you to search for a massive number of words, sometimes the name of the company, which is on the header and footer of every single document that there is. And quite often that's, what can I say, a delaying tactic?
Police were looking at 20 or 30 words to try and target the right information. The defence came up with 306 words. So working with the judge and with defence, we whittled that down to a more reasonable level, something that we could look at.
The results from these keyword searches proved extremely valuable to the case against Paul Seekins and Luke Ryan.
So the forensic digital examination of all of the digital devices, that revealed that there was no evidence to show in any of this carbon credit sales that anyone had made a profit on their investment. There were 2 or 3 people that had got their money back, but that's not the same as making a profit on an investment.
In 2021, after 7 years of police investigation into their business, the trial of Paul Seekins and Luke Ryan began. As well as using the evidence found in Tracy's forensic data search, police called upon a witness who had first-hand experience of Seekins and Ryan's criminality, journalist John Cuthill.
They asked whether I would be a witness and go to court, take the stand, and talk them through what we did and talk them through our part in exposing Luke Ryan and Enviro Associates for the individual and the company that they were. I was assured it was just going to be a day, turned out to be 3 days.
In May 2021, Seekins and Ryan were found guilty of fraud. Luke Ryan was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Paul Seekins, 13. Tracy's evidence allowed the prosecution to prove conclusively that having forensically examined every one of the millions of documents, nobody had ever made any money from the scheme. The defence had nowhere to hide, and thanks to Tracy, justice was done.
Because of the excellent evidence that the team put together, and it was a watertight case, the jury came to the right conclusion and the judge summed it up beautifully.
Her words were, that this investigation had consumed the lives of the investigation team over many years.
The two individuals got 19 years between them, which is the biggest fraud sentence that I've ever heard of. So it was great, I think, for the team and for Andy, that the judge recognised how much work had gone into it, how serious the crimes were, and I think that they were rewarded, if you like, for getting through what was a hugely long and complex case, and that was a great result for them.
Forensic work is key to this, and Trader Sex Ireland was able to facilitate us to examine this data properly and fairly in order to get the correct outcome at court.
Once I realised the extent of the fraud and that the individuals involved had deliberately preyed on people's good nature in order to take their life savings in some instances, then yes, I was absolutely convinced this is something we need to get done, and was hugely grateful that we'd had that little bit of extra time, because it would have been an absolute tragedy if this case hadn't come to court.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
An expert witness is critical because they're going to have that deep level knowledge to really determine if something stands out that doesn't look quite right.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
My brain just sort of exploded with different ideas. Even a single-celled organism can solve a crime.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
We're constantly evolving, constantly improving. It's soon going to become impossible to get away with murder.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
That was one of my eureka moments in all my 30 years of forensic examination.
The chances of finding something were really incredibly slim. That tiny possibility had to be explored.
I've seen people talk about justice being done, but no matter what kind of punishment he faced, it would never be enough.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, we're in Glasgow to reveal how an expert witness used clues hidden in soil to link a suspect to the murder of a young nurse.
We could do a whole suite of analyses that would help us work out where, spatially, that soil could have come from.
And we reveal how after a case was considered closed, one expert witness turned an investigation on its head.
What appeared on the face of it to be a fairly routine investigation actually turned into something that was highly unusual and interesting.
To the naked eye, it may just appear as if it's soil. But within it, there are so many stories that it can tell.
In April 2015, Karen Buckley, a 24-year-old Irish nurse studying in Glasgow, was enjoying a night out at the Sanctuary nightclub with friends. At 1 a.m, Karen left on her own and was never seen again. At the time, journalist Chris Clements was a reporter for the Daily Record. He covered the story of Karen's disappearance from day one.
Karen Buckley had only just arrived in Glasgow a few months before her disappearance. She had been having drinks with friends. Around 1 o'clock, she left the club. She disappeared. Nobody knew anything about her. She left her jacket in the club. Her friends raised the alarm because they couldn't get hold of her on the Sunday, and that then sparked a police search for Karen Buckley.
Police began their investigation by studying CCTV footage of the night in question that showed Karen outside the nightclub.
They seen her speaking to a man outside, big chap, 6'4", stocky build. They've had a short conversation. The two of them then, for whatever reason, went to his car, get in the car, and they drive off.
Detectives set to work on identifying the man who drove Karen away. Meanwhile, Karen's distraught parents left their home in Ireland to travel to Glasgow to help the search for their daughter. Sally Hanlon is the founder of Irish charity Support After Crime Services. She helped Karen's family throughout the ordeal.
It's the phone call that everybody dreads, that somebody of their family has gone missing. People think the worst, but hope for the best. On arrival in Scotland, the police requested or offered to the family, would they like to go on television, national television, and make an appeal?
We just want Karen home safely. We are desperate. She's our only daughter. We love her dearly. And if anybody have any information, please come forward. Thank you.
We can't imagine the mixture of emotions that must be going through their heads. Despair, sadness, wishing that the right answer is going to come, but still having little doubts that the wrong answer will come.
The Ford Focus, which drove Karen away from the club, gave police a starting point. From the registration number, detectives were able to identify the driver. 21-year-old Alexander Pacto.
Alexander Pacto came from a good family. He was from a wealthy family. He was privately educated, but he, from a young age, from late teens, he was involved in criminality. One of the things he was convicted of was printing fake banknotes.
As well as having been convicted for fraud, Pacto had been arrested and charged with a serious sexual assault on a woman in Glasgow in 2011.
He was accused of attacking a woman, dragging her down an alley and attempting to rape her in Glasgow city centre on a night out. That went to trial, but he was found not guilty.
Now, detectives were investigating Pacto a second time. CCTV showed Pacto's car being driven away from the nightclub, stopping off briefly at Kelvin Way before arriving at his flat on Dorchester Avenue. When police searched his home, Karen wasn't there. But a forensic search found traces of her blood. And there was more that made police suspicious.
I remember a detail from the time. I think it was police had said that when they first arrived, they noticed a really strong smell of bleach. So he was engaged in an effort to try and get rid of any evidence from his flat that would link him to Karen Buckley.
Detectives immediately brought Alexander Pacto in for questioning.
At what point did you first see Karen? Outside the club when I met her outside the sanctuary on Saturday night, Sunday morning at about, it was around 1 o'clock.
Pacto claimed Karen accompanied him to his flat and then left at 4 a.m. He said she had cut herself on the bed frame, and that would explain the traces of her blood. Detectives had nothing to prove otherwise. Then, a member of the public discovered Karen's handbag in a bin in nearby Dorsham Park.
Since Karen's handbag was found here yesterday, police teams have been combing through the undergrowth looking for any more clues to her disappearance.
Detectives turned again to CCTV. It showed that Pacto drove with Karen in the direction of Dorsham Park after stopping off at Kelvin Way, but that was all. Investigators needed to work out what happened next.
At this stage of the investigation, the police were pretty sure of who the culprit in this case was. They may not have shared all that with the family, and that would be to protect them until they were 100% sure they were on the right track.
It was pretty clear-cut from the beginning that Alexander Pacto had done something to Karen Buckley. So it was just a case of them trying to kind of retrace his steps all through that period when Karen had went missing.
Detectives continued to scour CCTV footage. Finally, they discovered Pacto the day after Karen's disappearance, buying large quantities of caustic soda. Chris Clement's newspaper, The Daily Record, broke the news that Pacto was a suspect.
There was a flat in Dorchester Avenue being searched by forensics. We quickly figured out that Alexander Pacto was the occupant of that flat, and we put it on the front page on the Thursday morning.
It was the first time Pacto had been publicly identified in connection with the case. And it's had an immediate effect.
A former acquaintance of Alexander Pacto spotted his picture in the paper, contacted the police and said he has a lockup in Milngavie.
Detectives rushed to the scene and found Karen's body. She was in a large plastic barrel. She had been dismembered and submerged in caustic soda.
The moment they were informed that Karen's body was found, their first reaction is, I got to go to them. I got to see them. I have to be there to hold them, to kiss them, tell them I love them. But in this case, it wasn't possible for them. And I think that must have been dreadful, knowing she was lying somewhere and they couldn't be with her.
In the city, shocked Glaswegians held a vigil for Karen and her parents.
It actually touched a bit of a nerve here in Scotland. And I think that's because a lot of young people, young women in particular, saw themselves in Karen. And through no fault of her own, she trusted the wrong person for a very brief amount of time. And that one decision proved to be fatal for her.
But the evidence against Pacto was only circumstantial. Police couldn't prove he committed murder. They couldn't prove that he was at High Creighton Farm where Karen was discovered, or at Dorsham Park where her handbag was found. But a pair of Pacto's muddy boots offered a possibility once in the hands of expert witness Lorna Dawson.
This was a pair of shoes which has a lot of soil on them. So this felt that we could do a whole suite of analyses that would help us work out where, spatially, that soil could have come from.
Lorna's soil analysis allowed her to determine the chemical makeup of the samples taken from Pacto's boots. She compared them with a database of soil samples taken from right across Scotland.
The results, when we looked at where the map was suggesting that they could have come from, it took us north of Glasgow and an area out around High Creighton Park. And that was a really, really important moment because we knew that there was nowhere else there or any other sample in our database that had that distinctive profile. We knew it must have come from that location.
Detectives now searched for further soil evidence that could narrow down Pacto's movements. His car had been professionally cleaned before he was arrested, but police were hopeful Lorna would be able to reveal a clue.
The vehicle was very clean, but when we looked underneath the vehicle, we were able to recover some material. And when we looked at the car tyres, we saw there was a band of soil which had avoided being washed off by the car wash procedure.
Once again, Lorna began her analysis to reveal where these soil samples had come from.
We showed that profile was very similar in terms of its hydrocarbon and its plant wax compounds, with the turning point at Dawson Park. This was quite important because what it did was it took that vehicle nearby the bin at the entrance to Dawson Park where Karen's handbag was found.
Detectives could now prove that Pacto drove to the site where Karen's handbag was found, that he had bought large quantities of caustic soda, and that he was at the farm where her body was discovered. Faced with this wealth of evidence, Pacto confessed to Karen's murder.
Pacto knew he'd been caught. He knew that the evidence was pretty much overwhelming that he had killed Karen. He's killed her in the car within 12 minutes, I think it was.
In the early hours of the morning, this is a quiet, dark street, and this was where he attacked her in his car. He put his hands round her neck and then bludgeoned her to death with a spanner, hitting her 12 or 13 times.
3 days after his confession, police divers retrieved the spanner from the canal at the end of his road. On it, they found Karen's DNA. On the 11th of August 2015, Alexander Pacto was tried for the murder of Karen Buckley.
The Crown brought together a whole suite of evidence, including the murder weapon, plus CCTV, plus the soil evidence that linked him to where Karen was found, and it also linked him to being at Dawson Park.
Murder trials or where there's a deceased are very difficult for families because you go into a courtroom, both parties are there, the accused is there, the families are there, and they have to hear the whole events of the night, so it's very difficult.
At the trial, Pacto quickly pleaded guilty.
Pacto's guilty plea early certainly brought the trial to a closure much faster than normally would have happened. So it is a benefit to the family.
Unusually, cameras were allowed inside the court as Judge Lady Ray addressed Pacto during sentencing.
Your killing of this young woman, combined with the extraordinary lengths to which you went to cover it up, display the actions of a callous and calculating man. You will therefore be sentenced to life imprisonment. The resultant punishment part is 23 years, backdated the 17th of April.
Karen's father, John, spoke outside the court.
All Karen was doing that night was making her way home when she was randomly targeted and murdered by a cowardly, vicious criminal. He's truly evil, and we hope he'll spend the rest of his life behind bars. Thank you.
Due to the excellent work by Lorna Dawson, he decided to plead guilty. If that forensic evidence wasn't available, maybe he wouldn't have such a quick outcome, or a conviction, or indeed a guilty plea.
I'm very proud that we were able to help in this particular case. The physical evidence of the soil and the vegetation had done its job because it had helped Pacto admit to killing Karen.
They do say that a picture tells 1,000 words. Most of my work is comparing injuries to a particular weapon. Basically, I match wounds to weapons.
The West Midlands, October 2004. In the quiet town of Willenhall, 69-year-old grandfather Mervyn Fletcher makes his regular trip to collect his pension from his local post office. At the time, journalist Nick Britton followed the case closely.
Looking into the case of Mervyn Fletcher, what appeared on the face of it to be a fairly routine investigation actually turned into something that was highly unusual and interesting. Every Friday, he would go along to his local shop, he would pick up his pension, he would then go to the shops to buy some provisions, and then return home along his regular route.
But this time, Mervyn never made it home. He was found lying in a pool of blood in an alleyway. His skull was fractured, apparently after falling against the wall. Unfortunately, the injury was fatal.
An initial post-mortem found that he had died from head injury, and police believed that he had simply had a fall from a diabetic incident. No more was thought about it. His family arranged his funeral and burial and said their goodbyes.
But several weeks later, Mervyn's family was astonished to discover that someone was using his bank cards to withdraw cash. Police were immediately suspicious. Detectives tracked down CCTV footage from the shop where Mervyn's card was used. The footage showed a man called Mustafa Abdullah was responsible.
Abdullah admitted using Mervyn's cards straight away. In fact, he admitted using them immediately after Mervyn had died, but he denied having stolen them. He actually said that somebody had given them to him, but he refused to name that person to police, and there's a reason behind that. His brother, Joseph Nwabuko, had been shot dead in Birmingham, and he feared very much that he would face the same reprisal if he named the person to the police.
Abdullah's confession raised a chilling possibility. That Mervyn Fletcher could have been killed by someone who stole his bank cards. Had Mustafa Abdullah been given the bank cards by the murderer, or was he the murderer himself? Detectives made a big decision. They decided to exhume Mervyn's body and carry out another post-mortem.
Another post-mortem was conducted by a different pathologist this time, and it showed up some startling things, notably that Mervyn had suffered a head injury that was consistent with blunt force trauma, so he'd been attacked with a heavy object. And it also showed that he had several broken ribs, and all of this was very consistent and underlined the fact that Mervyn had in fact been attacked.
Based on these new findings, the police began looking more closely at the circumstances around Mervyn's death and their only suspect, Mustafa Abdullah.
But what they didn't have was anything that linked him to the assault, and therefore they didn't at this stage have anything that would stand up in court.
Police decided to review the post-mortem photographs, looking for some new evidence. They turned to expert witness and forensic image analyst Derek Tremaine.
I've been identifying injuries for about approximately 25 years.
Derek works at the National Injuries Database, part of the National Crime Agency, a resource that's called upon by police forces up and down the country to help them solve cases of serious crime.
They had nothing. There was no links. I think they had a suspect in mind at that point, but they had nothing. We were asked to look at the case to see if we could sort of add anything to it or discover anything.
Derek was given the photographs from the post-mortem to analyse to see if anything had been overlooked.
Quite often, patterns are missed at the post-mortem because the pathologist would write a patterned injury and that would be it. It would be moved on. So quite often we would look at the injuries and we look at it in very fine detail.
Immediately, something struck Derek about the shape and pattern of Mervyn's injuries.
I instantly noticed there was these series of angled, evenly spaced lacerations, and they were fairly deep. I had noticed that I'd actually seen this before, just literally several months before, that I had done a very similar case and I recognised this injury. And this was caused by a thread on a dumbbell bar. The screw threads that hold the weights on, he was struck with this, leaving telltale marks in the scalp.
Derek searched his database and quickly found the photograph of the dumbbell bar from the case he'd worked on just a few months before.
I still had the photograph of the dumbbell bar from the previous case, and it was a good scaled photograph, so I did an overlay of the dumbbell bar on the lacerations, and it matched perfectly. Obviously, these injuries showed that there was a deep-seated injury to Mervyn and showed that it was a violent attack.
Based on this new evidence, the police obtained a warrant to search Abdullah's home.
They found a dumbbell bar. Within the threads of the dumbbell bar, they found Mervyn's DNA. And then, of course, they had the link.
The police were delighted that Derek had provided them with the crucial evidence they needed to be able to bring Mustafa Abdullah to court for the murder of Mervyn Fletcher.
Ultimately, my evidence was very important because it was a link between what had happened to Mervyn and the suspect. And obviously, once they had found the weapon in his home, that was it.
In 2007, Mustafa Abdullah was found guilty of the murder of Mervyn Fletcher at Wolverhampton Crown Court and was sentenced to life imprisonment.
The family gets closure because obviously they thought it was an accident to begin with, but obviously it turned out to be a very serious murder. And by me recognising that particular injury pattern, we could link it to a weapon that was found at the suspect's home.
Clearly, if it hadn't been for Derek Tremaine spotting this pattern of evidence from the dumbbell that he'd got from a previous case, the police may well never have solved this crime and may never have got their man.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
An expert witness is critical because they're going to have that deep level knowledge to really determine if something stands out that doesn't look quite right.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
My My brain just sort of exploded with different ideas. Even a single-celled organism can solve a crime.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
We're constantly evolving, constantly improving. It's soon going to become impossible to get away with murder.
This is the inside story of how science helped solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
That was one of my eureka moments in all my 30 years of forensic examination.
The chances of finding something were really incredibly slim. That tiny possibility had to be explored.
I've seen people talk about justice being done, but no matter what kind of punishment he faced, it would never be enough.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, we show how mobile phone data helped solve a murder investigation against the odds.
I expected that my evidence was of going to be no value to the investigation. Any chance of getting any evidence from those phones had gone.
And we reveal how forensic analysis of artwork uncovered some costly hidden secrets.
It was about the last X-ray plate we took of the day. We developed it, and suddenly at the very last minute, we'd discovered this key piece of evidence.
Your phone will generate records, even when it's in your pocket, because it will be connected to the network and to its best-serving cell at that time. These aspects might seem insignificant, but when analysed in relation to a criminal offence, can be crucial.
Aberdeen, Scotland, 2016. 37-year-old Jessica McGrath is found dead in a flat in the city centre.
The body of 37-year-old Jessica McGrath was discovered at a flat in Union Terrace on Friday afternoon.
A post-mortem revealed that Jessica had died from asphyxiation. Her neck had been compressed and she had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Danny Shaw was the Home Affairs correspondent for the BBC at the time and remembers the case well.
There was immense media interest in this case because it was a horrific murder, a horrific crime of a young woman who had been killed in such a brutal fashion. And it sparked widespread revulsion about what had happened to her. And naturally, there was interest and anguish about the circumstances of Jessica's death.
Jessica was a single mum trying to make ends meet by working as an escort. Her violent murder sent shockwaves around the city.
This was a case that was unusual in the sense that it happened in Aberdeen. It's not a city where this type of killing is commonplace. And the circumstances of what happened, the brutality involved, really do mark it out.
Detectives began their investigation by studying CCTV footage of the area around Jessica's flat at the time of the murder. It revealed a vital lead.
They were looking to trace Jessica's last movements. And what they found through CCTV images was that she had left her flat to go to some student accommodation in Aberdeen, stayed there a short while, and then got a taxi back to her flat. It also showed that she was accompanied on that journey by a young man, and that was crucial evidence.
Through CCTV, detectives were able to identify the man Jessica had been travelling with.
The man was a Nigerian student who'd arrived to study in Aberdeen just a few weeks earlier, and his name was Chinda.
Detectives immediately considered Chinda a suspect. Meanwhile, they spoke to the taxi driver who drove Jessica and Chinda to her flat on Union Terrace.
During those interviews, it emerged that Chinda and Jessica McGrath had been discussing money Now, that was significant because it might have provided a possible motive for the killing if there was a discussion or a dispute about money and whether or not he was going to pay her. That could have been a potential motive.
Jessica owned 2 mobile phones, yet both were missing from her flat. This seemed significant, and detectives studied records from her service provider.
Police also found that Jessica had made a call from her mobile phone shortly before Balachinder left her flat. Now, that data from the mobile phone was obviously really important because it enabled police to place Balachinder at or near her apartment. Because CCTV images, it also showed that he had left her flat and was walking away from it shortly after she had made a final phone call.
Detectives now suspected Balachinder of murdering Jessica in an argument over money and of taking her mobile phones in an attempt to hide evidence. They arrested him.
Balachinder denied all the allegations. He did tell police at one point, after he'd been arrested, that he'd been on Union Terrace because he'd met a woman and had sex with her there and then left. So that appeared to be an attempt by him to provide an explanation for why he was in that area at the time.
Police could not prove otherwise. So far, they only had circumstantial evidence against Chinder, but had a hunch the records for Jessica's missing mobile phones could provide vital information. So they turned to expert witness and cell site analyst Paul Hope.
Cell site analysis is indicating the potential location of a mobile phone, and we do that using the call records which are produced by the network and include all details of all the events that your phone undertakes, whether that be text message, voice call, mobile data sessions, and which cell ID, importantly, was used to make that connection.
A cell is the device that receives and transmits mobile phone signals.
If you look to the top of the mast, there are some white plates, and those plates are cells, and each of those cells has a specific cell ID number, which identifies that cell from all the others in the UK.
The cell ID number is recorded each time a mobile phone connects to it, creating a data record which Paul can gather during a process called RF surveying.
So, while we're walking along, the backpack is taking readings of the cell IDs that are best serving cells in this location. And it's also giving me a GPS location of exactly where this backpack is at the time it's taking those readings.
By analysing the cell site's data record, Paul can determine the location of a mobile phone at any given time.
When we get back to the office, we'll be able to use that data and create really good maps of exactly which areas in this area those cell IDs are providing coverage.
Police hoped he could use the data record to reveal the movements of the victim's 2 phones on the night of the murder.
What's crucial to the case is, where did the phones go? If Mr. Chinder took them, can we prove it? If they were still in the flat, why hadn't they been found during the searches? Nobody else has been seen leaving the flat. The police believed that Mr. Chinder has taken them and disposed of them on his route home.
Paul's cell site analysis showed the phone's movements matched those of Jessica and Chinder, as shown on CCTV. But he also spotted something that would prove vital to the investigation.
Crucially, the call data showed a call coming into one of the phones at 13:22, which is a few minutes after Mr. Chinder has been seen to leave the flat. We have a call at 13:22, which isn't answered, and immediately after that, both of the victims' phones are turned off and never turned on again. The cell ID that was used for the call at 13:22 now becomes crucial to my investigation. If that cell ID can be shown not to provide coverage at that flat, then Mr. Chinder must have taken that phone when he left the flat at 13:17.
So detectives knew from CCTV that Chinder left the flat at 13:17. If the cell analysis showed that at 13:22, Jessica's phones were no longer at the flat, but at Chinder's location, it would be evidence he had taken her phones and implicated him in Jessica's murder.
I'd looked at the data, I'd looked at the CCTV. The cell ID that was being used at that time, did that cell provide coverage at the flat, or did that cell provide coverage on Mr. Chinder's route home?
At 13:22, the phone was connected to a single cell ID. Paul's map showed that cell should provide coverage to both Chinder's location on his route home and the area around Jessica's flat. If that was the case, the phones could have been in either location.
In many respects, my evidence was of going to be no value to the investigation. I expected that. I went into that thinking, well, I'm going to find it.
But Paul did not give up. He visited the crime scene and began to survey the area with his equipment, and noticed a particular characteristic.
A lot of the buildings in Aberdeen city centre are built of granite. Mobile phone signals struggle to go through dense objects such as stone, granite buildings. And cell IDs that I would have expected to provide coverage to Union Terrace didn't because of the granite buildings.
Paul studied the coverage provided by the cell ID he hoped would link Chinder to the missing mobile phones. He was intrigued to discover it did not provide coverage to Jessica's flat.
Probably because the Union Terrace flats were made of granite, that cell ID did not provide coverage at the flat. And in this case, that was crucial. So I was able to say that the victim's phones at 13:22 were not in the flat with Jessica. We know that the offender left at 13:17, and we know the route that he took, and we know that at 13:22, the victim's phones were using cells that were providing coverage at points along the route that Chinder took. As no other person was seen on CCTV leaving the flat, this strongly suggests that Chinder, having been with Jessica earlier in the day and in her flat, that he had left the flat with the phones, and then at 13:22, when one of the phones has rung, he's turned both phones off and disposed of them. And that in itself is damning evidence.
Detectives now had enough evidence to charge Chinder with murder.
Within a few days, he had been arrested and charged and brought to court for this crime. It took some time for the police to obviously get all the evidence together for the case to be prepared for trial, but it shows how the events can be put together, pieced together bit by bit to lead police in a particular direction to actually finding the perpetrator for this dreadful crime.
Bala Chinder faced trial at the High Court in Aberdeen on the 4th of January 2017. He was found guilty and sentenced to a minimum of 18 years in prison. Key to the case was Paul Hope's cell site analysis.
The police never found the phones, so we'd no idea where the phones had ended up, and we still don't. And that includes Mr. Chinder's phone, which had been turned off earlier in the day. All three phones had gone. Any chance of getting any evidence from those phones had gone. The only thing we could rely on was the call data that had been produced by the network.
When you look at a case like this, it didn't solve itself. Expert witnesses helped the police and prosecutors put together a timeline of Jessica's last movements and link her to Bala Chinder. So they were crucial in helping police bring Bala Chinder to justice.
Those closest to Jessica hadn't known she was working as an escort at the time of her death. It was believed she was undertaking this work to raise money to support her young son and her family in Nigeria.
Of the many cases that I've dealt with, this is one of the most upsetting cases. This was a young woman who had a son who had a whole life to live. And within a few weeks of arriving in Scotland, a young man murdered her in the most brutal circumstances.
There's plenty of justice that needs to be given. The cell ID used by the victim's phones at 1322 should, under normal circumstances, have provided coverage to that flat. In this case, I feel that justice was served because that flat was built of granite.
Art isn't just about aesthetics, it's also connecting us deeply to our past. And in that, understanding what it's made of can make the difference between it being considered real or fake.
London's art world in the late 80s and a number of paintings by Austrian artist Egon Schiele are being sold by the capital's auction houses and attracting big interest and big money. Art historian and writer Ferren Gibson is an expert in Schiele's work.
Schiele was an Austrian artist, an Austrian expressionist, and people often discuss him in the same conversation as Gustav Klimt. And his work is often very emotional. The figures are very expressive. And as you see in Klimt's work as well, there's that use of gold that's quite seductive.
One particular work, painted in 1909, came to the attention of Marie de Balcony, a Swiss art collector.
It's a very fabulous painting. It's called Youth Kneeling Before God the Father, and God's arms are really wide, and there's gold material, and he's got one eye open looking down at this youth. This painting was brought to Christie's in 1987. Marie Zellinger de Balcony bought the painting that same year.
A keen arts lover, Marie paid £557,000 for the work. However, sometime later, she read a critical analysis calling the painting's authenticity into doubt.
Marie, she was actually quite happy with it, I think, for 4 years. It wasn't until 1991 that she became aware of the work of Jane Callard. And she is an expert on Schiele. She's written his catalogue raisonné. She's written several books about his work. And she was not confident about the authenticity of this work. And that was obviously a red flag for de Balcony.
De Balcony was left convinced the painting was in fact a forgery and that she should get her money back.
So she went to Christie's and she says, "Can I have a refund?" Now she's at the very tail end of a 5-year window of where she can request a refund. So it's key that she kind of gets in under the wire there.
Before agreeing to refund her money, Christie's began an investigation. Their experts examined the work under UVA light and revealed areas painted over after Schiele's death. But this was not unusual.
Overpainting might happen in the case of a conservator trying to repair a work, something gets damaged. In a museum setting, this is very common, that a conservator may come in and restore an older work. There are examples using X-ray where we can see where artists paint over their own work, and that can be quite exciting. That's like uncovering a mystery where you see, oh, they've moved a hand, or there was an entirely different painting under here and maybe they weren't happy with it, or for whatever reason they repainted it. So that does happen.
Christie's investigation concluded that the painting had simply been painted over during restoration, that they had verified it in catalogues and in articles, and they were satisfied that it was indeed an original Schiele work.
Christie says to her, "We have accurately represented what the work is, and in this case, we do not owe you a refund." The conversation between de Balcony and Christie's escalates, it carries on for a while, till she eventually decides to take them to court to sue for that money.
To begin to prove her case, de Balcony sent the work to art detective and expert witness, Dr. Nicholas Seastore, for scientific analysis.
In this particular case, the painting that we were studying is considered to be around 1909. And it's then up to me to say, does it fit that? Can we tell from the material structure that it's going to be a painting from that time? And we're looking for physical evidence. The colours, are they consistent with what we might expect. Are the cracks in the paint the sort that we would expect from a painting that was effectively 100 years old? This is a photograph of the painting as it came to me. You could already see, just looking at it, that there were areas of damage that were underneath other layers of paint. So it was clearly a painting with these kinds of condition problems. But it was a question of actually looking in very closely and plotting out in detail just how much was original and how much was later addition. We could see from the outset that there were two qualities of paint, one part of an original layer underneath and more paint that had been applied later on top. So we had a clear sense of this dual layer structure. So much of what you can see in this image is actually of later addition.
But were these later additions evidence that the painting was a forgery? Nicholas began his investigation by analysing samples of paint. He was looking for pigments that weren't used or hadn't been invented when Sheila was alive.
There are some key pigments that have come in the later 20th century after Sheila's lifetime. And if we were to find those, then it would rule it out entirely. In the underlying painting, we didn't find anything like that. It was consistent with the kinds of materials we would expect at the period.
Nicholas concluded the lower layers of paint were authentic, but the upper, overpainted layers were more suspicious.
The entire painting had been covered up with another layer. So that immediately sort of prompts questions about why did they do this? Was it so damaged that they had to completely repaint it? Or was there some other purpose in doing this? We realised that actually, if you could see the original, you couldn't see very much of it at all. So I did a very careful mapping of what you could see and found that only 8% of the original painting was visible.
92% of the artwork had been painted over, but not by Sheila. For de Balcony and her lawyers, this amounted to a forgery. But in court, Christie's refused to give in.
Christie's lawyers argue that no amount of overpainting could make this a forgery because the original work is by Sheila. So they basically start to equate it to a restoration of a work rather than a forgery of the work. And it's a fine line to determine the difference between the two.
On its own, the overpainting did not prove the work was a forgery. Nicholas looked for further evidence of a modern restoration and began a deeper analysis. One feature intrigued him.
We were also interested in this inscription, and you can just about make out the E and the S of the Egon Schiele.
Nicholas could clearly see the E and S of Egon Schiele's signature or monogram on the top layer of the painting. He now searched for a monogram in the bottom layers of paint, hoping to compare the two.
We tried various imaging techniques. We've got a couple of very standard. One is using infrared radiation, the other one is using X-ray. And nothing particularly showed in the infrared in that area, and the X-ray suggested there might be something, but it wasn't very easy to read. And so, I was working on a sort of Friday afternoon on this and decided to use a slight variation on X-ray, and it sort of turns the technique around. It would be like looking at the skin layers, shall we say. And it was about the last X-ray plate we took of the day, and we developed it, held it up to the light, and there was a different monogram underneath.
The monogram on the upper layer of paint had a separate E and S, but in the monogram in the lower layer, the E and S were on top of each other. For Nicholas, this was a vital clue.
Here we have a selection of signatures and inscriptions, dates, from works that are known to be by Egon Schiele. So they are examples of how he would sign his paintings and drawings. We can see that there's a huge amount of variation in just how he would put his mark on the works. Because he was so variable in how he signed himself, It gives the possibility that you can tie it down to a particular year of production. So you could say with the 1911 ES, this E and S is much closer to the E and S on the young man painting, but the dating is wrong. Is the wrong form of signature for a painting of 1909. So suddenly at the very last minute, we'd discovered this key piece of evidence.
The suspicious inscription was evidence that the overpainted layers, which covered 92% of the artwork, were not painted by Sheila. Nicholas's evidence was presented at court.
It's the inscription that is the key step in this, because this played into questions of whether somebody was trying to perpetrate some form of deception through obliterating damages or hiding something that might have been a problem with the inscription and signature.
The judge was convinced. He instructed Christie's to repay Marie de Balcony the full purchase price of £557,000 plus interest. Nicholas Eastor's evidence was crucial.
An expert witness is critical in a case like this because they're going to have that deep level knowledge and technology to really determine if something stands out that doesn't look quite right. So you need those people that wherever a work might be acquired or viewed, that they are there to say, yeah, this is an authentic work, this is fine.
The extensive restoration carried out on the painting, Youth Kneeling Before God the Father, means experts no longer credit Egon Schiele with creating the artwork.
I think people have an idea that art is static. You go to a gallery and you look at the painting on the wall and somehow it was always thus. In actual fact, paintings, they change. They change more slowly than we do. So we can't see these things as static objects. Authenticity in art can have real-world consequences. Certainly we're talking about monetary value. It can make the difference of millions of pounds.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
An expert witness is critical because they're going to have that deep level knowledge to really determine if something stands out that doesn't look quite right.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
My brain just sort of exploded with different ideas. Even a single-celled organism can solve a crime.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
We're constantly evolving, constantly improving. It's soon going to become impossible to get away with murder.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
That was one of my eureka moments in all my 30 years of forensic examination.
The chances of finding something were really incredibly slim. That tiny possibility had to be explored.
I've seen people talk about justice being done, but no matter what kind of punishment he faced, it would never be enough.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, we're in Yorkshire for two shocking cases. Each involves a murdered woman with their partners as suspects and an expert witness who helped deliver justice. In Hull, grains of pollen put a violent man behind bars.
Pollen is everywhere. You can have it in your hair, on your clothing, and it will link people and objects with places.
And in Melsonby, an expert witness discovers the truth behind a husband's lies.
Her husband said that she'd been held
hostage in this area for a certain amount of time, and that really didn't fit.
Plants give you vast amounts of information. They produce pollen, they produce spores, they get in the air, they get in the soil. The plants themselves can tell you a lot by the way they behave. All these things give you information.
Hull, Valentine's Day 2005. Paul Dyson calls 999 and reports his fiancée, 22-year-old Joanne Nelson, missing.
Hello there. My fiancée, I don't know where she is. I just want to report somebody missing.
This is part of the emergency call he made to the police.
Has there been any arguments or anything, or should you press?
No, there's nothing like that.
Journalist Ralph Blackburn reported on the story of Joanne's disappearance.
Jo grew up in Hull. She was the eldest daughter of Jean and Charlie. She had two younger sisters, Katie and Janie. They were a very close family.
Joanne lived with her fiancé Paul, and detectives interviewed him to find out more about when he'd last seen her.
He says they woke up at their house in West Hull in the morning as normal. They exchanged Valentine's Day cards, and then he left her in bed and went to work. He then told the police that when he returned home in the evening, she wasn't there and that it was out of her character.
The search for clues to Joanne Nelson's disappearance intensified today. Specially trained officers scoured the area around her home. They looked in back alleys, on waste ground and in outbuildings.
Police were increasingly concerned as the days passed. Fiancé Paul offered to make a public appeal for information.
I want to know where she is. I want her back.
Usually when people are very emotional and are recounting a potentially traumatic event, they might change their words slightly, get some details slightly different. However, the account Paul gave on TV mirrored the exact same account he gave to detectives when he was first interviewed, and it struck as something that was potentially rehearsed.
Eagle-eyed detectives noticed another alarming clue on screen.
I want to know where she is.
Police spotted small crescent-shaped marks on his thumbs, which are caused typically when someone is trying to defend themselves against strangulation. The police's suspicions of him were heightened, and they began not only scrutinising his own account and narrative, but they also began interviewing both his family members and Jo's family members.
Police discovered that Joanne's family had concerns about the relationship and had been against the pair moving in together.
Her parents probably saw a few red flags with Paul. Jo and Paul were quite different people. There was an 8-year age gap. Jo was very family-orientated, young, ambitious. She wanted to travel the world. She was sociable. Whereas Paul had had quite a difficult start to his life. And, you know, he wasn't really a kind of ambitious guy. He didn't have a huge amount of friends.
Further investigation revealed the family were right to have concerns.
Awful details about his violent past against women came out. It turned out that he had been seriously abusive towards his ex-wife. He had throttled her on their wedding night. He used to beat her. And one time he had actually strangled her so badly that she passed out.
Detectives received a shocking tip out of the blue from a member of Paul's own family.
4 days after Jo's disappearance, the police took a call from Paul's mother, and she sensationally revealed that Paul had confessed to a friend that he had actually strangled Jo at their flat.
Police rushed to interview Dyson.
He confessed to strangling Jo at their home and disposing of the body somewhere in North Yorkshire.
Detectives' earlier suspicions about Dyson were now confirmed. This was no longer a missing persons case, it was a murder investigation.
The boyfriend of 22-year-old Joanne Nelson has been charged with her murder. Paul Dyson appeared in court in Hull and has been remanded in custody. 80 police officers are continuing their search for Joanne, who disappeared on Valentine's Day.
Dyson admitted to the killing, but claimed it was an accident. To prove otherwise, detectives needed to find Joanne's body, but Dyson said he could not remember where he had hidden it.
The police were searching a huge area of North Yorkshire. A lot of it was very rural. They were looking for a small woodland. There are a lot of woods in this area of North Yorkshire.
Searching for a body. Humberside police believe Joanne Nelson has been dumped in the open near a wooded area. But the area they're searching is over 100 square miles along the River Humber and the River Ouse. The search area is so vast, 80 officers are now involved. The police say they believe Joanne's body may be near a farm gate, and they're asking farmers from Hull to York to check their land.
After weeks of searching, the investigation was getting nowhere. Detectives needed help to try and narrow down their search area. So they turned to expert witness, Professor Patricia Wiltshire, a forensic ecologist.
I use all natural things in the environment to help give intelligence to the police and also provide evidence that will link people and objects with places. But I suppose I am best known for looking at pollen grains, getting pollen grains from people's clothes, from their vehicles, from their shoes, and saying, there's a likelihood that this person has been in this kind of environment.
Detectives were keen to know if Patricia's knowledge of pollen or palynology could help them find Joanne. They had seized items from Dyson, including trainers, a garden fork and a car.
Pollen is everywhere. You can have it in your hair, on your clothing. I get the trace evidence from the clothing, from the footwear, from whatever. And you have to get rid of all the messy background. So we have the most incredibly nasty, dangerous set of alkalis and acids that the sample is boiled up in, and eventually, hopefully, you're left with a fairly clean sample of pollen and spores.
Once this process is completed, Patricia can microscopically identify the assemblage of pollens in the sample and build a profile of the area where they are likely to be found.
The pollen profile was really interesting. It showed woodland, there was no doubt about that. But it was interesting in that it had trees in it that you would expect to be in a forestry commission plantation. But then there were a lot of native trees as well, birch, and there was some oak, there was some hazel, and so on. But I got plants like heather and some aquatic plants and some grasses.
This matched what detectives had been told by Dyson, that he had dumped Joanne's body in a small wooded area. Patricia was sure she could give the police more to go on.
What was clear to me from where I found the pollen was that car had travelled probably along a track, and there was heather growing along the track because the pollen was caught in the spoiler. And that told me that it's an acidic soil, a sandy soil. So you need to look immediately for the areas that would support the sandy soil.
Patricia cross-referenced ecological maps of the area to narrow the search. These maps detail what vegetation can be found in any part of the UK.
We've got people checking the whole country all the time for plant distribution through the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. The country is divided into lots of little squares, 1 kilometre by a kilometre. And all these people are responsible for a square kilometre. So you've got these recorders looking for plants all the time.
one plant stood out in Patricia's samples.
I had this polypodium fern. It's called Polypodium vulgare. It's a pretty little fern. It's small, only about a foot or so high, and you find it growing on banks. It will grow on tree trunks. And when you look at the maps for its distribution, there isn't any in that area. And it brought it down to one woodland. And when I told the police that, they'd been looking all around Hull, you see, and they were really quite shocked.
Patricia had pinpointed a spot around 100 miles away from the home Joanne had shared with Dyson, and a good 50 miles from where police had been searching.
Dyson had told them that he remembered a metal gate with some bottles at the side and Christmas trees. Because the police couldn't wait, they rushed off and they went driving round the lanes up there. Lo and behold, they saw the gate, they saw the bottles. They went in and started driving up this path and they said, oh God, it's just as Pat told us it would be.
There were more clues that Patricia was able to give police. She found birch pollen inside the car from Dyson's shoes, and another item yielded more evidence.
They'd given me a garden fork, and that garden fork had 85% or more birch pollen on it, hardly anything else. I said, most likely she'll be in a hollow near birch, and she'll be covered with birch twigs where he's dragged it with a fork. And that's where they found her.
On the 24th of March, 39 days after Dyson confessed to killing Joanne, police finally discovered her body beneath bin bags and hidden in a place exactly as Patricia had described.
Well, of course, that looks like crystal ball, doesn't it? I mean, it just looks like Mystic Meg type stuff. But actually, it's common sense.
Police have confirmed that a body found in woods in North Yorkshire yesterday is that of the missing woman Joanne Nelson. 22-year-old Joanne, who's from Hull, disappeared on Valentine's Day. Her body was discovered concealed in woodland. A post-mortem examination revealed she'd been strangled. Her fiancé has been charged with her murder.
The discovery of the body, along with Dyson's cover-up of the extent of Joanne's injuries, left the detectives in no doubt that this was no accident. It was murder.
The evidence the police had was so overwhelmingly against him that shortly before he was due to go on trial, he changed his plea and admitted to murdering Joe.
Without Patricia's forensic expertise, detectives may never have found Joanne's body or secured a murder conviction.
Finding that body was done largely on the palynology. If the palynology led them to the body and was also similar on Dyson, I think it shows quite a link between the deposition site and the body and Dyson. That's corroboration.
In November 2005, at Hull Crown Court, it emerged what had happened to Joanne.
It turned out the motive was incredibly trivial. He was quite a lazy, slovenly guy and would often leave washing around the house. Joe joked to him, saying, "Do you even know how to turn on the washing machine?" And when he actually couldn't, he flew into such a rage that he strangled her to death. After Dyson had callously strangled Joe, he immediately went to the shop to buy rubber gloves, disinfectant, bin bags. He cleaned up the scene and he put her in the boot of his car and went to his mother's house to pick up a pitchfork, which he then used to bury her.
On the 8th of November, at Hull Crown Court, Paul Dyson was sentenced to life in prison to serve a minimum of 16 years for the murder of Joanne Nelson.
You just think about the poor parents and her relatives. They desperately want their child back. And the very fact that we were able to locate the body and bring her home in a relatively short time was very valuable to the family. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that I was part of that.
Bloodstain pattern analysis is an important tool, especially in violent crime investigation, because if anybody is injured and their blood is distributed throughout a space, then we can use the pattern of that distribution to kind of tell a narrative about how injuries have been sustained, activities that people have undertaken after they've been injured.
A typical day in the quiet village of Melsonby, North Yorkshire.
It is bordering on chocolate box pretty, is Melsonby. It's the kind of village where people like to retire to and live quiet lives. It does have the lovely village green, and I know it's got a real good sense of community as well. It really is a nice place to live in.
But on the 23rd of March 2010, this sleepy village was struck by tragedy. An attack at the local post office, run by Robin and Diana Garbett. It was a huge story for Melsonby and for Joe Willis, then editor of the Northern Echo.
We received calls to our news desk. We were alerted that just after 8:30 in the morning, the North Yorkshire Police received a 999 call from Robin Garbett.
Is the attacker still nearby?
No, he's gone.
Were any weapons involved or mentioned?
I think the guy with me, he had a gun, and he said to me...
He had a gun, sir?
Well, he did have a gun, and he said, don't be stupid.
Robin told the operator that there'd been a burglary, that had been held up, essentially. The mechanism on the safe for the post office would only allow it to be opened after 8:30. This robber had waited until after 8:30 to then rob the post office to get the maximum amount of money. So then Robin had gone upstairs where he'd found that his wife had been attacked. When they arrived, the emergency services found Diana Garbett in one of the bedrooms in bed. She was face down. She'd suffered a serious head injury and she was declared dead at the scene.
A major police investigation has been ongoing ever since as detectives search for the killer. It was a crime which shocked the picturesque North Yorkshire village of Melsonby.
Following the murder, I think the village and the wider community of Richmondshire was alarmed that potentially there was a violent criminal on the loose.
Police teams scoured the local area for evidence. Meanwhile, detectives pieced together the events leading up to Diana Garbett's death. Her husband, Robin, said the raiders held his wife hostage.
He said, don't do anything stupid, we've got your wife.
But at the murder scene, detectives were perplexed. If Diana Garbett received her head injuries whilst being held hostage, then police would expect to find signs of a struggle, like bloodstains on walls and carpets. But there were none. They turned to blood spatter analyst Joe Millington.
Given her injuries, there was this assumption that wherever Diane Garbett had been assaulted, there would be lots and lots of blood spatter. Lots of blood would have been distributed around the crime scene. And because they'd examined the bedroom where she was found and had not found this spatter, they naturally assumed that that was not the site of assault. So I was called in to examine the scene, and I did that initially from photographs. They were just simply passed along, and I had a little look at those to see whether or not I could see anything of interest. When I looked at the photographs, I could see that there was a pillow and a pillowcase, and it had blood staining on it, and it looked like there was some detail in that blood that I might be able to get some information from. So I asked whether or not I could examine that in person. There are a lot of blood vessels on your scalp that can bleed quite profusely if injured, and the pillowcase and the pillow were absolutely saturated in blood, such that it still had the indentation where her head had been.
To understand what this pattern of blood staining revealed, Joe first needed to understand the injuries Diana had received.
Essentially handed over a polystyrene head to the pathologist and said, can you draw on it the injuries that she sustained, which he did using a biro. I've used a polystyrene head a couple of times in casework. It's a very clean way of depicting very complex evidence, and what it enabled us to do was to put the injuries in context with the bloodstain patterns that were found on the pillowcase. So in this particular case, we distinguished this injury here, which was on the left-hand side of her head, demonstrating through the blood patterns on her head that this is very probably going to be the first injury. And when her head was on the pillow, as that injury was created with something, a weapon of length, it's transferred this kind of rust type of smear onto the pillow. And then in order to expose the right-hand side of her head and the forehead, because she was found on her front, it's actually very easy to do that by just literally turning her head, presumably to look at someone who has hit her on the head at position 1. And that's precisely what we believed happened in this case. So it's all very much contained within this one little sort of ecosystem of the bed and on the pillow. And it completely explains why, when the police went to the scene, they didn't see any spatter, because all of the spatter is on the pillow.
Joe's conclusions contradicted Robin Garbutt's account that his wife was taken hostage by burglars and then attacked. Instead, it showed she had actually received the first blow while she was still asleep.
The detail of the blood was so important in ultimately demonstrating that she didn't actually move very much. She was probably asleep, she turned her head, the assault continued, and then she lost consciousness and ultimately died. And of course, there's an account from the husband that said that she'd been held hostage in this area for a certain amount of time, and that really didn't fit with this account that she's probably asleep.
Detectives now turned to look more closely at Robin Garbutt. They began by examining his finances.
When police began looking into the financial affairs of the post office, they realised that the couple had financial worries. They had several credit cards that were maxed out. They seemed to spend a lot of money, and it wasn't necessarily clear where the money was coming from to pay for these things. They then looked a little bit deeper into the finances of the post office, and it certainly seemed to the investigators that again, all was not as it seemed, and that potentially money was being taken from the post office.
Police next discovered from friends and family that there were tensions within the couple's relationship.
Perhaps not everything was okay in the Garbutts' marriage. Certainly, Diana Garbutt appeared to be unhappy in that marriage, and was potentially looking elsewhere for affection.
Detectives could show Robin Garbutt had severe money problems and that his marriage was unhappy. Meanwhile, Joe Millington's evidence revealed that Diana had not been taken hostage, but was attacked while she slept. Finally, a post-mortem revealed she did not die at 8:30 a.m, as Garbutt claimed, but hours earlier. Garbutt was arrested and charged, but despite all this evidence against him, he denied murdering his wife.
So when the trial came along, we literally just went with a pamphlet of photographs to reflect to the jury how the reconstruction of the injuries and the bloodstain patterns overlaid each other and became this really powerful strand of evidence. And of course, that was absolutely incongruous with the account that Robin Garbutt had produced. There was just simply no real window for that level of interaction with attackers to have taken place while she was still asleep.
Robin Garbutt was found guilty of the murder of his wife Diana and was sentenced to life in prison to serve a minimum of 20 years.
Diana Garbutt's mother was there in court every day of the trial. and I'm sure the effort that the police and the experts put into this case meant a huge deal. Forensics played a huge part in securing conviction.
The North Yorkshire Police Commander gave me a commendation for this case, even though it's just a very simple piece of evidence in terms of BPA and pathology and a pillar case of all things. The fact that it was a pivotal item in the progression of this trial is evident in the fact that they recognised it and gave us a commendation for it.